Did you know that you're losing control of your brain every single day? In fact, you only have 5% left and it's shrinking rapidly. Basically, in 2016, a study found out that 10% of people have this problem, meaning they couldn't even work long hours or even think straight. But it's been 8 years now, and that number has increased so much that you could be next. But what if I told you that there's a quick way to solve this? This is me at 16. I used to have this problem, but in a matter of a week, I freed myself, breaking no sweat. And trust me, I looked at studies, read books, and spent hours researching this, so I could reveal to you everything. So to start, let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a TikTok addiction and a drug addiction? Well, what if I told you that it's not much? To find out, we have to go back a full decade. In 2015, two researchers took this photo. This is an MRI scan of someone who's addicted to the internet. But here's the thing, this scan is more haunting than you think. Basically, in 2020, I actually had a brain like this because gaming, YouTube, and porn pulled me in like an addiction. And with this brain, I had the worst problems ever. You know, whenever you walk past a drug addict and you see how he can't control himself? Well, whenever I got home, the first thing I would do is game and game and game for hours until I had to go to bed. This cycle would repeat itself every day because just like an addict, I was hooked. But there's a reason I was stuck in this endless loop. If you go back into the brain, there's this thing called dopamine. But with this dopamine is the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. To keep this short, let's say you're watching TikTok, right? The limbic system is what keeps you consuming, but the prefrontal cortex is supposed to stop you, right? But here's where things get dark. When you have this brain, the dopamine link between these two parts of the brain gets cut. It doesn't exist anymore. This means that you can't tell your brain to stop consuming. It's going to keep you scrolling for many hours until you realize that it's dark outside. Now you might think that you don't have this problem, except gamers, TikTokers, and gooners are not safe. They all have this. In fact, the average TikTok user spends 5 hours a day just doom scrolling. And let me tell you something, okay? When you're scrolling, you know that weird feeling? The feeling where your brain just isn't awake. And then you realize that 3 hours have already passed and you're still scrolling. Well, that's because of the severed dopamine link. That's why you're so addicted. So this begs the question, what will happen if I have this? Well, there's a point of no escape. You know those types of people who ruin their entire lives because of their gooning habits? Like you'll see a 40-year-old, for example, who just goons every day. Well, those people are so deep into their addictions that they can't fathom getting out. But the worst part is that more and more people are ending up like this. It's never been easier to fall that deep. In fact, I remember when I was 15, I used to game a lot. In fact, I remember when I was 15 years old, I was so addicted to gaming that I could never see a life where I wasn't gaming. It was just a part of me. In fact, let me ask you this. If you're addicted to gooning, right? Were there times in your life where you thought you could never escape from this addiction? That's exactly how I felt, right? With all these different bad habits. And it's a horrible feeling. But here's the thing. This actually has a name. It's called behavioral addiction disorder, and it's where you develop an intense urge to repeat the action over and over again. This problem ruined my life. It gave me endless brain fog, I couldn't think clearly, my focus was terrible, and life became 100 times more difficult. And I just never noticed it because I was so addicted, right? I never noticed all these bad side effects. So you're probably wondering, how do I stop this? Well, first, we have to understand gray matter. Let's go back to the MRI scans. If you look closely at the edges of the brain, you can see a gray outline. This is gray matter. But what's so important about this? Well, gray matter is a tissue in the brain. Without it, your brain wouldn't be able to work. They're responsible for processing info, thinking, and learning. But here's where things get sinister. There was a study that tried to learn how this tissue gets affected, right? However, what they found will shock you. You know TikTok, social media? Well, we all know that 90% of young adults obsessively engage with TikTok, right? Well, what they found out was that the gray matter of the average TikToker got damaged significantly. This means that with their fried attention spans, they can't think clearly, losing control of their brain. In fact, I actually remember having this issue in particular. When I was 15, I had this thing called brain fog. If you don't know, it's this fuzzy feeling that makes you feel like you're tired, and I would wake up with it every morning. However, when I actually had to use my brain, for example, do an assignment, this made things really difficult. I would go back to scrolling, I would struggle to even begin the task, and keep in mind, I was 15 years old. I was doing 500-word essays back then. That's not hard. If this relates to you, then that means you have the same issue as me. Your grey matter sucked. But it gets deeper, because your grey matter isn't the only target. There's a region in the brain called the amygdala, right? It's what regulates your fight or flight signals. But this part of the brain is under attack, which causes you to lose your impulse control, making you more and more impulsive. In fact, it's getting so bad that some people's impulse control are like children. And the worst part is that this is easy to fall into. Like, all I did was play video games, jack off, watch YouTube all day, and just scroll. You know, that's all I did. And my impulse control was horrible. But with this impulse control, life became hell. Like, I remember in high school, I had all these desires. I wanted loads of friends. I wanted a girlfriend, of course. But with this impulsive, fried brain, I would get insane anxiety, which would stop me from going outside my comfort zone. Meaning, I would achieve none of those, leaving me sad and quite lonely. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because every single mental problem you're facing is purely because of this issue. You're losing control of your brain. Anxiety, low attention spans, and poor focus don't come out of nowhere. But then something changed. One day, at 16 years old, I thought to myself that I could change anything. I could eliminate all of my mental problems if I just reclaimed my mind. And so I did. Now that I have full control of my brain, it's never been easier to focus, socialize, and crush my goals. I'm free from the pain of anxiety, I can talk to strangers effectively, and I can get way more done than 90% of people on this planet, all because I took control of my brain. So now, this leaves you with one question. How do I stop this? Well, what if I said that you can reclaim your brain in no time? Because if you didn't know, I was able to cure this problem in the matter of a week, and I've never felt more in control in my entire life. So here is my 3-step protocol to reclaiming your brain. So step number 1, I'm going to keep this one short, but there are habits you must avoid. I'm talking TikTok, social media, YouTube, films, as well as gaming. Gaming is interesting because I'd argue it's the worst one out of these, even competing with TikTok. Because there are tons of studies showing that gaming reduces impulse control. And I can tell, because here's the thing. Not to attack you or anything, okay? But lots of people just argue to defend their own gaming habits, you know? And this type of defense mechanism is actually a sign of addiction. Even I did this at one stage. So yes, I'm going to be tough on you. Stop gaming for 2 full weeks and see what happens. Now for step 2, you've probably heard of a dopamine detox. Well, we're going to take that and make it way better. You see, usually in a dopamine detox, we get rid of distractions and solely work. And that's good, but that doesn't do the trick. The problem here is that 2 weeks isn't enough to heal your brain. You're going to need more time. So how long? Well, 30 days. That's so long. You don't want to be doing that, right? Well, I got just a trick to make it shorter. You're going to detox for a week, right? But in this time, you're going to do a list of habits, which I like to call the golden 5. First is meditation. Do this for 5 to 15 minutes, okay? Second is grounding. Put your feet on the grass. Third is Wim Hof method. Fourth is morning work. And fifth is watching the sunrise. The golden 5 have healed my brain to a point where I can do things at will. Like today, I just did everything at will. I didn't have to get motivated. I didn't have to use certain tricks. It was purely just discipline. But here's the thing, I got a trick up my sleeve. You can get the most out of these habits if you just do this, right? Let me explain. So there's an effect called snowballing, right? It's when you do a habit as you wake up. And once you do that habit, the effects of the habit will actually snowball throughout the entire day. This is why you get brain fog, right? Because the first thing you do when you wake up is scroll on TikTok. However, if you do half of the golden 5 in the morning, your brain is going to be clear as a crystal. So do these habits in the morning. And finally, for step 3, addiction. Let me tell you a story. When I was 18, I was fighting a porn addiction. I would go 4 days to a week without consuming, but afterwards, I would relapse anyway. It was important I beat this because this was ruining my life. However, the one thing that porn addiction did was that it destroyed my brain. But after I cured my porn addiction, right, my brain bounced back so hard that it's now 100% clean. Now, this might sound like a tough third step, but what if I told you that there's a way to quit porn that's easy? I have a video that will cure your porn addiction, right over here. No willpower, is a completely new method, and it's what got me off the addiction. Very effortless and easy. Now, that's how you cure your brain rot. Subscribe and keep never quitting.